What is happening with coalitions? What will we learn at the first sitting? And what will still remain undiscovered and unknown after that sitting? All that and more in this episode. Welcome back to SMWX. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. Great to have you back around here. SMWX stands for the Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh Experience, your number one destination for insight on South African politics. We're going to answer those three questions I mentioned at the beginning of the show. The first question is, what's happening with coalitions and where do we stand? The second is, what is going to happen at the first sitting of Parliament? And the third is, what will we learn and what won't we learn by the end of Friday? Let's get right into this coalition conversation. Now, it seems to me, as I mentioned in previous episodes, that a particular picture is crystallizing of an ANC-DA plus coalition. I have repeatedly stated that I will not be calling this a government of national unity because I don't believe it fits the definition. And if you want to know more about the definition, you can check the latest video, which has been watched over 100,000 times. But we've effectively got a coalition here, which is the ANC and the DA. And I think it's time for us to take a step back and just witness how dramatic a shift that could be in South African politics. Also, the IFP, which will be one of the minor parties, and I suspect a few other smaller parties, just to deflect from the fact that this is really ultimately going to be driven from its center by the ANC and the DA together. The first thing to mention is that this is a tremendous flip-flop. I mean, we talk about flip-flops in South African politics, but the ANC and the DA working together may just be the biggest flip-flop in the last 30 years, right? These are sworn enemies. These are parties that have been at loggerheads throughout the entire election campaign. They have been at each other's throats, accusing each other, on the one hand, of being a colonial, white, racist party. That's what the ANC has said of the DA. The DA has said the ANC is a failed, corrupt, kleptocratic, criminal enterprise, right? And the two are now coming together in a political marriage. Their narrative is that they are trying to put the interests of the country above political party interests. And what I will do in this episode is I'll show that there are opportunities and threats to this alliance that need to be considered. Those who are opposed to it need to consider the opportunities, and those who think it's going to be perfect need to consider the threats. But I do just want to focus on keeping politicians accountable to what they say, and particularly politicians who are powerful. We can talk about other opposition politicians, smaller parties, but here's the principle that I subscribe to on this channel, and I think we need to subscribe to more in South Africa, which is the most accountability needs to go to the most powerful people. And I see people trying to deflect from those who hold real power by trying to criticize those who actually don't hold power. And ultimately, I think one thing we've learned about the last 5 years is that when you don't hold people who are actually powerful accountable, such as the Ramaphosa administration, then it takes 5 years, nothing happens, and you turn around and you question why nothing happened. Well, nothing happened because the public didn't put accountability. So whatever coalition comes out, I think it's fundamentally crucial. And I speak to colleagues who work in the media here. I speak to activists. I speak to people who I know now watch this channel from every corner of our society. We cannot let this new government just get away with murder or feel as if their feet will not be held to the fire from day one. We tried that for the last 5 years. Our role as a society is not to be praise singers for our government. It is to hold them accountable and always remain critical. If they do that which is praiseworthy, then we praise them. But we don't praise them in advance by trying to create some kind of fake sense of unity or fake sense of comfort for those who hold power. So that's my view. Now, for the ANC and the DA to come together represents, and I'm going to talk about some of the threats first, a very dangerous potential moment in South African politics. And really, I'm actually not going to be mincing my words going forward, because this really represents a potential alliance between conservative forces in our society, big politics, particularly the Cyril Ramaphosa faction, big media companies who have consistently protected the president, consistently failed to hold a particular faction in the ANC as accountable as they hold every other politician, rightly. And big capital, concentrated financial interests who dominate South Africa's economy to the exclusion not just of the poor majority, but to the exclusion of 99% of South Africans, right? So we have the potential collaboration here of a new tripartite alliance between the Ramaphosa faction and the DA, big media, and big capital. And what I'm worried about in that moment is that there will be very little space for critical reflection. And critical reflection is the lifeblood of democracy. Because if everyone is agreeing and if everyone is joining a chorus of praise singing, what gets lost is a clear-eyed view of economic, social, and political reality. So one of the things that I'm worried about in an ANC-DA plus national coalition is that the space for opposition has shrunk, and also that the space for critical engagement on platforms that matter, platforms that have a reach, will shrink too, because everyone will be keen to try and gain favor with this new alliance, a very powerful alliance, an alliance of two forces that have been separated for the last 30 years, which seem to be coming together, politics and capital. And they have now united explicitly, even as many people claimed they had united implicitly for the last 30 years. I think we need to appreciate that the policy irreconcilability between these two parties, at least on paper, is something that needs to be understood and grasped and grappled with. Who will budge? Who will compromise? And on what will they compromise? I think that's going to be a key question for any new ANC-DA plus government. It looks like the IFP is going to be included in this arrangement. Now, remember that the IFP has a much, much less percentage of the vote than any of these, like 10% of what the ANC's vote share is. And so they won't be in a position to call the policy shots. They'll be a much more minor player in this coalition arrangement. But I think there's also an interesting historical story here about the IFP and the ANC, who have an interesting history. They come from the same place. The ANC and the IFP split largely around the question of Umkhonto weSizwe, funnily enough, the original version, and the IFP's refusal to join armed struggle against apartheid. That's where the historical split happens. And now we actually see something of a reunion. We had a first reunion around 94, and that was an important reunion because of the political violence that had built up to that important democratic breakthrough moment. And the IFP remained in government for a long time. They then largely split away from the ANC for a period. And now we have this reunion of those two forces. And I think that historical narrative shouldn't get lost as we also focus on the ANC and the DA. A remaining question for me is which small parties are going to be brought into this coalition? And for those small parties, they must be very careful that they're not just used for window dressing or for tokenism. Because ultimately what the ANC and DA will want to do is not cast this as an ANC-DA partnership because they saw the public backlash to that. And so they're going to add on parties onto this arrangement to try and muddy the waters and distract from the fact that these two opposing forces have now come together. So those small parties, how much say will they have, and to what extent will they just be there for symbolic reasons? Small parties, just as they can gain leverage from being small, they can also be used. And I think we're going to see various politicians being used for unknown political ends. Some of them may not even understand that they are being used. And so small parties need to be, I think, quite vigilant and quite careful as they engage in this coalition arrangement that seems to be unfolding. So there's a lot that's happening around all of this that's leading me to this conclusion. I think the first things we saw were massive moves in metros. So we saw in eThekwini and we saw in Ekurhuleni some moves which seem to be the preconditions of this coalition pact coming together. And I want to talk about both of those. It seems clear to me that in eThekwini, where we've had a disastrous period where the ANC has led in coalition, although there's a slightly different arrangement in eThekwini and other municipalities, where it's not exactly the same as an executive council. But we've had a disastrous coalition that just simply has allowed that metro to decay before our very eyes. And the mayor has now left, and I'm thinking that could be a precondition of some kind of ANC, DA, IFP active cooperation. We also see that in Ekurhuleni, the EFF MMC for finance was fired. We know that the EFF was targeting Ekurhuleni if it was going to be in a coalition arrangement with the ANC. So I take that as a signal that the EFF ANC coalition negotiations have broken down, and that Ekurhuleni could be one of the moving parts in this broader picture. And what we may see is the DA regaining control of Ekurhuleni, or at least much less EFF influence over that city. So I'm thinking that those developments are suggesting to me that a GNU in its true sense, which would include the entire political spectrum and a wide representation of the electorate, is not happening. I think that there were probably negotiations between the EFF and ANC and DA to see if the EFF could be accommodated, but it seems to me that those negotiations seem to have broken down as we speak this evening. So what I would be watching for is, will this ANC-DA plus coalition focus on trying to woo the EFF in a last-minute shock where the EFF joins? I think that looks unlikely from this evening's vantage point, but if that happens, it would be a tremendous shock tomorrow. So what I'm expecting is very much for this ANC-DA plus alliance to forge ahead. Now, there are a couple of things that I think we also need to think through if this is the emerging picture. The isolation of the EFF and MK from this arrangement is one that we need to think through. The different spheres of government and how they will work is another that we need to think through. And who will get what position is a third aspect. Now, when we think about the spheres, before I come to what this means for the EFF and MK, the spheres of government, which are the national level, the provincial, and the local level, I think are going to be central. And all of those are going to be moving parts in this arrangement. And so what we need to look at, and incredibly, all these spheres are probably going to be decided over the next day or two, at least the national and the provincial level. So what's going to unfold on Friday, I think, is something like this. You're going to get the provinces, and I suspect that the provinces are going to be decided slightly before the national picture, because there are just fewer members of the provincial legislatures who have to vote. And that will then feed into the national picture, so that Friday we'll be getting these provincial announcements at the same time as the national picture will be building up, probably to culminate somewhere in the evening. And of course, there are really only two provinces that we really want to keep an eye on. That's KZN and Gauteng. Now, one of the other dangers for the ANC-DA plus coalition is going to be what they do with KZN. And I want to venture that this coalition must be wise and must avoid being too greedy. If they insist on trying to exclude MK Party from KZN, and they want to take full control there, full control in Gauteng, and full control nationally, I think that would be a foolhardy decision for national stability. And ultimately, I think it's fair, given the sheer amount of votes that MK Party got. Leave aside whether you agree with MK or you disagree with them, just based on vote share. Just as it's right that the ANC should get the presidency in South Africa, I think the MK Party has, with many, many more votes than the second place party in KZN, a legitimate claim to being able to be the key driving partner of any governing coalition in that province. And to deny the MK Party that governing position would, I think, be foolhardy, to the extent that it is inevitably going to lead to retaliation from the MK party that could lead to a destabilization of KwaZulu-Natal. I'm not necessarily suggesting violence at this point or anything like that, which is a trope that surrounds the MK that I think we need to talk about more, because so far that trope has not held, at least with court outcomes and electoral outcomes, despite their attempt to impugn the electoral outcomes, which I think is ultimately folly. But if it's true that the ANC at 40% is the right party to drive the national governing coalition, then by that fact, it must also be true that the MK with a higher vote share at 44% is the right party to drive a governing coalition in KwaZulu-Natal. And an attempt to exclude the biggest party, I think, is a recipe for political disaster in KZN. It's a recipe for instability. However, when you look at KZN, it's roughly balanced 40 seats, ANC, IFP, DA. If they get together, they have 40. MK, EFF, and NFP together have 40. I suspect MK can get over the line. All they need to do is convince the NFP. We know that Zuma has worked well before with the NFP and actually brought the NFP into cabinet when he was president. The NFP itself was very convenient to the ANC, to the extent that when Zuma was in charge of the ANC, the NFP party was able to dilute IFP votes by being a breakaway and a split from that party. So the NFP and Jacob Zuma have worked well together, and I suspect that Zuma has the capacity and the ability to sway the NFP. But even if he doesn't do that, are you telling me that all those ANC MPLs in KZN are going to vote loyally to the ANC? That's one to watch. This is a secret ballot vote, and I'll be watching very carefully to see if the ANC caucus holds united, especially in a place like KZN. And the MK party will clearly probably be trying to divide that caucus so that they're not just relying on one vote, but they can get a little bit of leeway. At the same time, the counterweight, the ANC DA plus coalition plus IFP in this instance, will be looking to remain and hold solid. And I'll also be looking out to see, can they hold solid? Because this will be the first political test of the unity of that fragile alliance. And it'll be interesting to see if they can ensure that their members toe the party line. So have a look at KZN and watch that very closely. I suspect the National Assembly will still be swearing people in, and it's going to take ages and ages. So keep your eye on KZN. Then there's Gauteng. And it looks to me like Gauteng is going to, as I said in previous videos, follow the same pattern as nationally. So this ANC-DA plus coalition is going to say, let's keep the same power base in Gauteng as well. So you're going to see some kind of ANC-DA IFP plus alliance. And there again, I think that is likely to be a little more stable than KZN because the seats are relatively comfortable for that alliance to gain a provincial majority. But they will be excluding the EFF, I think, from that alliance if the metro signs are anything to go by. Also watch the ANC and EFF press conferences today to get a sense of what they're thinking. And so what we're going to have is an excluded EFF, an EFF that has resigned itself to playing an opposition role, and the National Alliance governing Gauteng. KZN remains a question mark. It's either going to be the National Alliance as well, or it's going to be completely different, and we're going to have some kind of MK alliance. So watch what happens over there. Now, it's really important to discuss the EFF and MK, because I think the analysis here is just completely hysterical and hyperbolic. And as a country, we need to talk about how mainstream media creates these echo chambers from which it's very difficult to extricate yourself. And I would just remind you about the kinds of echo chambers that were around in mainstream media before the election, which completely skewed the direction of this election. And places like SMWX, which were a lot more dispassionate, I think called this election much more closely. And so the current narrative is, firstly, that the EFF and MK are somehow the same thing. They're two very different parties with different histories. and indeed different ideological outlooks, and that they are representatives of what John Steenhuisen calls a doomsday pact. They are authoritarian, ethno-nationalist, kleptocratic, and the worst thing that has ever existed in South Africa, right? That's the narrative. That's just not true. I think all parties have their extreme elements, extreme aspects, but there's just this tendency to use tropes and rely on shorthand when it comes to the EFF that I find unscholarly and just intellectually lazy. So what's actually going on here? These two parties face very serious tests in the future, just as the ANC and the DA face heavy tests in this alliance that they're forming. The EFF and MK also face important tests, and the tests are existential for everyone in this post-May 29th landscape. Here's the test for the EFF. The EFF, I think, would have had its eye on being able to govern something important after this election. Most people would have agreed that the EFF plus the ANC alone would have been a governing coalition in one scenario. And it turns out, much to the disappointment of the EFF, I'm sure, that because they came down below 10% and the ANC fell so far, that power block isn't big enough for a national coalition. Now it seems that the EFF will be excluded from any governing coalition. So what this means is that the EFF will be one of the country's main opposition forces. And to me, it seems like the EFF is at something of a crossroads, a really important moment in its history, because either the EFF is going to use this opportunity to grow into an important alternative opposition force in South Africa and allay people's fears about corruption within the party and about an authoritarian streak within the party and about its inability to govern if it ever gets power, or it is going to fade further from 9 backwards and roll back and become a less important force in South African politics. So the party really has a strategic decision in front of it. How does it seize this moment and move forward and win over South Africans who continue to be skeptical? It's important to remember that the ideological purity of any particular political position cannot actually succeed in this environment. In an environment of coalition politics, compromise is unfortunately the name of the game. Realpolitik is the name of the game. But what compromises and what forms of opposition politics are going to be a key question. If the EFF antagonizes too much and goes too far overboard, they're going to lose that segment of South Africans that are still not lending them their vote because they haven't quite convinced them that they are the party to actually take responsibility and not just antagonize and oppose. So the EFF now needs to formulate an opposition strategy that will see it into the next phase of South African politics. And being in opposition could be a gift or a curse depending on how they play their hand. Same thing for MK. Clearly, nationally, it seems that they will be on the outskirts. And again, the question remains, are they going to overplay their hand? Will they remain internally coherent? Or will they lose that internal coherence? We've seen internal disruption in the party since its inception. Or will they take this massive surge of support and be able to leverage it and, again, prove those who are on the fence wrong in terms of their capacity to govern and to govern in the interests of people? Or will they confirm people's fears about the extent to which the party can cohere, can actually deliver on some of its ambitious promises and confirm those fears? And those fears have to do with corruption. The Zuma era was definitely marred by corruption allegations and some conclusive proof of widespread corruption. So they need to be able to allay people's fears on that in this new iteration. as well as questions of stability and national stability and KZN stability. And so we need to see the extent to which MK can do that. So these two opposition forces now have it all to prove in many ways, but they also have it all to win. Because what South Africa desperately needs in this moment, and I don't know to what extent this can come from opposition politics, it may have to come from outside formal politics and civil society and the media space and citizens, is a contrast to the current government. Because unless that opposition and that contrast is formulated, like I say, democracy will suffer. Because otherwise we're just going to get one line of thinking, one picture, and one narrative. And what we need is a contrast to that narrative, which says that there is a new and a transformed and a different society that can be built. It doesn't need to be built on authoritarianism. It doesn't need to be built on instability, but it needs to take very seriously the questions of racialized and gendered inequality. It needs to take questions of transformation seriously. It needs to take questions of foreign policy and South Africa's position in the geopolitical landscape seriously, and the question of South Africa's capacity to be a broker between the global South and the global North, and to play its role of strategic non-alignment and using international institutions where necessary to cut against the inequalities within systems of global governance. It needs a coalition inside and outside politics which protects workers' rights, which defends the gains of transformation, which ensures that the important democratic gains made through the Labour Relations Act and Land Tenure Rights Acts and National Minimum Wage Acts, and acts which defend and protect the social safety net around the most vulnerable are preserved and conserved and defended. And unless we have that counterweight in society that needs to come from inside formal politics and outside formal politics, we are going to be lost in a narrative that is sold to us by big politics, big capital, and big media. So I think South Africa has a big task on its hands there. Let's move on to the first sitting tomorrow. Now, the first sitting is going to be a fascinating moment again in our country's development. This is what I'm really looking out for. Who is going to be speaker and who will be deputy speaker? And will that speaker come from the ANC? If that speaker doesn't come from the ANC, I think we're in a very interesting and a new world. Will that speaker come from the DA? That will signal that the DA is interested particularly in the legislative oversight role and will start to play that role. And we will for the first time see a parliament which is not led by the ANC for the first time. You know, it also struck me the other day that all parliamentary committees pretty much are going to have ANC minorities. I think parliamentary committees are often usually around 11 members. And I looked at the calculations, and at 40% of seats, the ANC is going to have 4 or maybe 5 members of an 11-member committee. So their capacity to dominate parliament is basically over. Of course, now they'll try with their coalition partners to dominate parliament, but I'm not so sure it's always going to be that easy. So have a very careful look at this vote for speaker, because I think that's what's going to be the most interesting vote, and of course deputy speaker. And let's see whether the ANC can secure those positions or whether it's been prepared to surrender those positions. That'll also give us an insight into whether other kinds of appointments may be surrendered to other opposition parties. Fam, you asked for some SMWX merch and we have delivered. I know you're always looking for ways to help support and grow this channel, so why don't you buy yourself an SMWX hoodie? Super comfy, super warm, and you can represent SMWX. You can check the link down below for how to buy your SMWX hoodie and help build and grow this channel so we can bring you more interviews, more analysis, and more educational insights. Now let's get back to it. So I think who becomes speaker is going to be the most important question of the first sitting. And as I say, it could be a DA speaker, in which case, again, the ANC and DA are going to be able to dominate both the executive and legislative branch. Or will parties around and across the spectrum prevail on the ANC-DA plus coalition to maybe pick a more neutral option as speaker, in which case we could have someone from a minority party, a smaller party, but who still enjoys support across different aisles of the House. So let's certainly watch out for that. And it's a closely guarded secret on which I cannot predict very accurately, but all I can say is it's either the scenarios I can present to you is ANC, which I think is less likely because then they would dominate both. And if they do, I think they again would be overplaying their hand. Then there's the DA option, which means that they've decided to keep power closely knit within the ANC DA plus coalition. And then the third option would be some kind of compromise candidate from outside. That also might happen with the deputy speaker. So we could get a president, a speaker, and a deputy speaker all from different parties in one scenario. So that's worth knowing. Now, what won't happen and what won't we learn tomorrow? Like I said again in previous videos, and continue to watch the archive because this is a developing body of political analysis. I'm not so sure that we're going to get any insight, even at the first sitting of Parliament, on what cabinet is going to look like. Firstly, I think it's going to just take longer to negotiate that. Up to this point, I think parties have only been able to agree on broad principles. And I think they're just going to be able to agree on president, speaker, and deputy speaker. And then they're going to deepen conversations after that. There's still the president that, needs to be sworn in. And so there's time for further discussions around particular cabinet configurations. So we'll move the conversation onto that once we get over this presidential election tomorrow. We've also seen, of course, around the first sitting that the MK party's attempt to interdict the sitting has failed, the Constitutional Court dismissing that before it could even be heard. So we know that the sitting is going ahead, that the highest court in the land has guaranteed its constitutionality, at least in terms of the questions of quorum and the constitution of the National Assembly. So will MK members of Parliament actually attend, or will they not attend? Will they attend in KZN and not in the National Assembly? In KZN, where they believe that they can actually win the premiership there, but not the National Assembly. That could be something that we see where MK party plays different strategies in different places. But I think it, in some ways, is a shame that MK will not be attending the National Assembly because they were ultimately voted to be representatives, and I suspect they will ultimately come to the National Assembly, and we'll see what the character of MK party will be as an opposition party. By the way, question for the legal minds who watch this podcast that I've been pondering. If the DA goes into government with the ANC in a coalition, are they technically part of the government, in which case they also can't be leader of the opposition? So who becomes leader of opposition in this parliament is also really interesting. Would the MK party become the leader of the opposition as the biggest opposition party outside a governing bloc? Otherwise, it would be the DA, but then if they were in government, then they wouldn't be in opposition. I know certainly in the UK Parliament, if you form a governing coalition, you're no longer in opposition. So either way, whether they're formally leader of the opposition, the MK party will be the biggest opposition bloc in Parliament. And ultimately, we'll see if they seize that opportunity or they squander it and cede ground to the new ANC-DA plus governing coalition. So we won't know what cabinet looks like tomorrow, but we will learn what many provinces look like, who the premiers will be in these different provinces. We've seen the ANC, by the way, shifting their premier candidates in a number of different places. I believe in Free State, they've shifted the candidate. In Limpopo, they've shifted the candidate. And in Northwest, they've shifted the candidate. And in the other 4 provinces which they govern outright, they've maintained their candidates. So that's also interesting to watch. So what we'll know is who the president is, and that's likely to be Cyril Ramaphosa. We'll know who the speaker is, who the deputy speaker is, and we'll know who all the premiers are. And we'll know what the balance of power looks like in the provinces. But we won't know fully exactly how that balance of power is going to play itself out in terms of the further appointments across the state that will need to be made. And I'll part on this shot that no matter how you look at this, the ANC is going to feel the loss of more power than ever before. The only question is, where is it prepared to feel that loss? Is it going to give up parliament? Is it going to give up proportions of cabinet? Is it going to give up metros? Is it going to give up provinces? Is it going to give up different committees within these provinces and within cabinet? Is it going to give up appointments of boards and state-owned enterprises, ambassadors, all kinds of appointments that we take for granted, even political appointments within departments and within ministries? All of that stands to fall. And the remaining question will be, where will the ANC be prepared to give up power? And what will the political backlash within the ANC be, not only to losing that power, but to ceding that power to its age-old rival, the Democratic Alliance? To what extent will this coalition hold? To what extent will it be stable, as it is purported to be? And to what extent will it be able to deliver not just on short-term economic stability and short-term market happiness, but long-term, real structural challenges to inequality, to poverty, to unemployment, to racial, spatial injustice? That will be the test of any government, and that will also be the test of any opposition to that government. It's all to play for in South African politics. It's fascinating to watch and observe. Listen, I don't know everything. I just try to give you as much analysis as I can, but I can be wrong. I might well be wrong on a number of issues. And what I enjoy in our comments is that we have important democratic debate and discussion. So let's continue to debate. You teach me what I may have been wrong about. I will respond, and let's continue this conversation. We'll be coming to you from Cape Town with a lot of episodes over this period, so stay tuned to our timeline. And I'd really appreciate it if you can help just share and boost this channel even more. Talk about us on social media, share the videos with your family and with your social media circles. I know I have really influential people who watch this channel. Even word of mouth, just talking about it to your friend or to the next person who you're talking about politics to. I just also like to thank two companies that are part of this SMWX community who have really helped us on this Cape Town trip to bring you all the content we're going to bring you. The first company is Black Brick. They have accommodated the SMWX team and also given you this wonderful venue from which we're going to shoot some content when we're not at Parliament. So I'd really like to thank the people at Black Brick in Cape Town, but they're also in multiple places in South Africa. If you're ever looking for excellent accommodation, make sure you check out Black Brick. And I'd also like to thank the people at Lula who are helping to transport the SMWX crew as we bring you this coverage. Lula's a company that takes particularly crews and companies and workers, whether you're going to a festival or you have an off-site event where you're transporting lots of people. Lula gets you from A to B in a really seamless way. And I want to give a big shout out to Lula. Thank you for watching this channel. Thank you for continuing to build and grow this channel into an important, independent digital force in South African politics. And I think after this government is formed, we might just be that crucial counterweight, that crucial critical voice that our country very much needs. See you in the comments. Aye.